is a video where they ask a load of primary school children to draw a doctor, or a surgeon, I think more specifically, to draw a firefighter and to draw a fighter pilot. And they all spend ages drawing and they're really good at it, but actually all they do is draw men in those roles. And then they bring out 3 of these people who do these jobs, and they've got helmets on for 2 of them, and they've got, the surgeon's got a mask on, and they have the big reveal, and they're all women. And the faces of the young people are a bit like, oh, okay. And they readjust and they go and they draw pictures again. And this time they've got a wider variety of gender in there, and they can see themselves. And in fact, I actually saw this happen. Someone I follow on LinkedIn actually said they were going on holiday and they've been talking about air pilots, and their young children were absolutely convinced that all pilots were men, and they just talked about these pilots and the man pilot will be doing this and the man pilot will be doing that. When they got on the plane, it was they actually got invited into the cabin. It was 2 female pilots, and then it was just like clicking a switch and just went, oh right, okay, I could do that too. And you just the representation and understanding of that is so important, and that's why that unconscious bias, that thing that sits really deep in your brain, is so important to understand. And that's why we've got Victoria Maxfield here today. We're gonna do some little activities and get us thinking about this.
Cool, thank you.
Oh, yeah, that was wrong.
Oh, before I've even started. Right, I'm trying to weld myself to the podium today so that I don't kind of wander off camera. So somebody shout or wave at me if I start to move too much. Okay, well, thank you all for kind of coming and participating in today's session. And I'm going to assume that you are going to participate because you will have to do things later. Before we go into starting the session, I want to talk a little bit about myself and introduce myself. So my name is Victoria Maxfield, Vicky Maxfield, if I've not been naughty. I'm a certified business psychologist, and I have a passion for reducing discrimination in workplaces. That can be in many different areas that we see it in. It can be in recruitment, it can be in performance management. It's everywhere, and I could go on for hours and hours, but I won't today. I've got a postgraduate diploma in psychology and a master's in organisational psychology, and I'm also currently studying my doctorate in organisational psychology. So if I look more tired than you would expect, that's probably why. My research is mainly into the barriers that women face entering into senior leadership positions, both through initially applying, but then also just in that in the situations that they may find themselves. As I go through this presentation, you might find I will say research shows quite a lot. A lot of the things that I do are based on research. I haven't added any of the references in here because that might be a bit too boring, but if you are keen on understanding where this has come from, come and find me at lunch, or if you're watching online, I'm sure my email address will be sent out. Just drop me a line and I can help you get access to those papers if you're interested in reading them. Okay, so a little bit more about me. So I spent the last 20 years working in large corporate organisations. So working with a lot of people and getting just genuinely fed up of just the general corporate structures and how we seem to be doing the same things over and over again and nothing seems to be changing. So I decided to go back to university, retrain as a psychologist, and then start to try and change things. I was diagnosed with dyslexia and dyspraxia when I was 22. So I think my journey through that corporate organisation was probably a little bit different from other people's, and certainly my journey through academia has been as well. So struggling a lot through school, a lot through my A-levels, not even knowing why. Still struggling through my doctorate. It's still tough, even when you do have diagnosis, it's still tough. However, I do have to acknowledge some of the privileges that I also carry. I am white, I'm heterosexual, and I'm able-bodied. So I don't find some of those compounded discriminations that other people might face. I didn't come from a wealthy background. My mum was a care assistant and my dad was, let's say, intermittently employed. But we always had food on the table and I always had stable housing. So that was an additional thing I didn't need to worry about. So why am I going into so much detail about my background in what is a relatively short session? So it's really important to understand where we come from in the way that we view the world. Our experiences, the things that we've been through in our childhoods and the societies that we live in change the way we view other people and incidents that happen to us. And one of the only ways that we can start to change that is by understanding where we come from and the internal workings of how we process things. So I will go into a little bit about the science of it all, but then we've got a big session where I want you to start thinking about privileges and then reflecting on what privileges you yourself have and what actions you can take. Now, the reason that I've made this quite an interactive session is firstly to keep you awake and focused just before lunchtime, but secondly, the research shows that you get much more benefit from an unconscious bias training if you're actually asked to reflect on your own approaches. Otherwise, it becomes just a tick box exercise of some training that, yep, we've done unconscious bias training, we can move on, we've solved our issues. So I want you to start reflecting on that. I've also will ask you, and you can see that there's some little QR codes on your desk, don't have to blip them just yet, but I'm going to ask you to reflect on that and set yourself an action that you're going to follow up on. And again, that means we're taking it out of the training environment and into the real world, so we're carrying those actions through. Okay, now I've done all of that setup, let's talk about what I'm going to cover today. So I'll cover a little bit about unconscious bias and the scientific background of it. I'll also talk about when this is more likely to happen, and then a little bit about what we can do about it, how we can change the way we process things and be more aware of it. Okay, so unconscious bias comes in, and you might also hear it called implicit bias. It tends to be referred to as implicit bias more in America than in the UK, but those terms are pretty much used interchangeably. It comes down to categorisation and stereotyping. So when little kids first start to learn about the world, and we all did it, they start to categorise groups of things together to help them understand how they should take actions and how they should view the world. Now, when they first start doing this, those categories are very big and very inaccurate. So a child might consider that all grown-up ladies are mummies and all grown-up men are daddies, and that's something that they have because it reflects what they see at home. My baby nephew is 3 now, so he's getting better at this, but when he was little and when lockdown first started releasing us to meet up outside and go for walks, we started walking down to the local stables. He's absolutely mad on animals, but everything that was in that field with 4 legs was a horse, regardless of whether it actually was or not. Now, as he got older and started to add more information into that, he understood the difference between horses and donkeys. And then even more information, he got to know all of their names because we were there a lot. Now, obviously, there wasn't a problem. He still loved all of those animals and wanted to pet them all. So it didn't actually impact on anything. But it shows you the additional detail that adds on to how we do our big groups. Equally, these groups happen, and we group people just the same way as my baby nephew groups animals. And as Kerry mentioned, one of the big groupings that we have is occupational groupings. And she talked very much about that exercise of getting children to draw it. One of the really interesting things is that some of the children that were asked to draw those things had mothers who were doctors and still drew the doctors as male. So it reflects that it's not actually just what we've got going on at home in our immediate environment that matters, but also that societal conditioning that can come into play. It shows you how much is important. However, these groupings are really important. They help us move through the world quickly. They help us make decisions when our brain hasn't got enough time to process information. So they're not entirely bad. So let me give you a little example here. So can anybody shout out what these images are of? Yes, great. Okay, a globe and a chair. Even though you didn't have the full information, you could still tell what was going on in these pictures. A couple more examples. Oh, I think these come up one at a time. Can anybody shout out what they think these 2 people do for jobs? Great, delivery driver and a waiter. We've got those cues that we take into account. We've looked at our environment, we've got these certain amount of information, and we can now say, okay, I know what these 2 people do. Imagine if we didn't have those groupings and we didn't have those stereotypes and those categories. Every time we would have to go through the full process of gathering all of that information. Imagine how exhausting it would be every time a person turns up at your table in a cafe with a notebook. You still have to go through all that process of understanding what they're there for. It would take ages. So this is why our brain does it. However, there are ways that we can start making mistakes. Where's my picture? Okay. This picture, for instance, we've got a medical mask, we've got a stethoscope. So all of the cues are leading towards medical professional. But if we were starting to drill down a bit further and potentially look at what kind of medical professional, doctor or a nurse, it might be that the fact that this picture is a man might lean us more towards doctor than towards nurse. And that's when our categorizations start to fail. We also get into trouble when some of those physical cues, those uniform cues aren't there. So for instance, the environment that we're in at the moment, if we had people milling around out the back there helping us with coffee, they might not be in uniform. So we might make certain assumptions about who was there to help serve us, not necessarily because they had uniform, but because of who they were. And that's where we need to start being careful. Okay, so any questions on that before I blast forward? No. I will mill round afterwards when you're doing the exercise. So if you've got any questions, oh, see, I'm doing it. If you've got any questions, you can ask me them then. Okay, so when is it likely to happen? So as I said, the reason that our brains do this is because we can only deal with a certain amount of cognitive load at any one time. And when our brains are already dealing with something, they will start to short circuit through to these stereotypes and these categorizations that we've created. This can happen when we're tired and hungry. It can happen when we're processing a lot of additional information. So perhaps we're in a situation where it's unclear or ambiguous, or we've got to take a lot of information in. When we're stressed or in an otherwise emotional environment. Now, when I've particularly seen some of these presentations given in certain environments, for instance, with police officers, as you can imagine, these situations arise quite a lot. They don't necessarily always get meal breaks. So it's quite important that in certain careers, we've really got that highlighted to say, in these certain circumstances, you will jump to conclusions about people and you need to make sure that you don't. It's really important to be conscious of that. Okay, what can we do about it? I'm moving on to our next action as well. Okay, awareness. So recognizing the situations when it can occur. And I would also say the situations where it has occurred, because we're not all perfect. We are going to make mistakes and we're going to do things that are not quite right. Hence why I have the picture of Lizzo up there. So is everybody aware of the Lizzo situation that occurred just recently? It was an example of something dealt with really well. So she used a term in one of her songs that shouldn't be used about people with disabilities. And her fans very quickly raised it to her attention, and she immediately re-recorded the song and reissued it. There was no excuses. There was no, well, it's going to cost too much to re-record and they're all out there. She just fixed it and apologized. That's brilliant. Mistakes are going to happen. Education is still ongoing. The key thing is we fix it quickly when we've made a mistake. Second thing is questioning your thought processes, especially in those situations where you think you might potentially make mistakes. Am I jumping to a conclusion about this? Do I have enough information, or is my stereotype flawed? That will help you stop some of these short circuits. Diversifying your environment and having wider conversations. So as I mentioned when we were talking about the kids, the wider their education gets, the more they're out there experiencing things, the more accurate their stereotypes get, and the more information that they can take in. Same goes for adults. We need to start making sure that we're out there having conversations, understanding different people's perspectives, so that we can add that information to our categorizations. And this final one is something that I want us to work on today, is understanding your own position. Understanding the privileges that you have and that other people don't have. And as I said, it's only by doing that that we can see where we might actually fail, where we've got a difference between us and somebody else, and we might not understand it from their point of view. Okay, so there's a group exercise. Some of you I see have been cheating and looking at it already. I'm looking at you, table of two. But what I need you to do is, so there's a list of privileges on your table. Each of these privileges costs £100. And on your table as well, you should also have an amount of money. That's the amount of money you have got to spend on your privileges. If you're on a table for two, you might want to merge with another table. It just might make it slightly easier. I'm not sure. It's up to you. If you want to do it just the two of you, I don't have a problem with that. But you might want to find a table that's got more money. I don't know. So you've got a set amount of money to purchase these privileges. What I want you to do is work as a team and talk about each of them and the benefits of having each of those privileges, and decide which ones you would like to purchase. I'm going to give you 20 minutes for this. Excellent. My alarm's gone off to tell me that you've all had 20 minutes. People are still discussing it. So, does anybody want to volunteer to have a conversation about how that felt? You don't have to tell me what your answers were. Do I need to give people a microphone?
Oh, the discussions are
excellent.
So we only had £500, so we couldn't buy ourselves very much, which meant that I think all of us definitely identified a couple as kind of fundamentals that were about physical safety. So these were like 4 that was about like being able to study because you weren't hungry, and 5 which was about stable housing. And then I think after that I guess that possibly based on our own different life experiences, we focused on different ones. But I think definitely because we didn't have much, we focused on those like core like physical safety ones to start with, and those were the ones that.
How did that feel? How did you think that might be to walk through the world without those privileges?
Oh, pretty bad. Some of them made me feel like quite sad, the idea of like not having them,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Has anybody else got any comments that you might want to make?
Hi, thank you.
Nice.
So yeah, our table agreed. Actually, we were looking for the perhaps ones which would cut across the board. So we also looked on having had stable housing and the ability to concentrate on studies because you weren't hungry. As you said, we were talking about our individual experiences then influenced which others. Although, as you say, we felt all of this should really apply. I think if we were pushed, we only had £300 to spend, so you were well off.
Yeah, that's the lowest.
We were really struggling. But we felt perhaps 27, but with a variation. So being able to apply for a job without worrying about whether you were going to be discriminated against. This says due to disability, but in our case, we were thinking in any way, whether that's disability, age, gender, you name it. So those were the 3, but again, because we only had £300 to spend, otherwise we'd have bought all of them. I think that's it.
Yeah, it's a tough one. Recruitment, as I said, I can go on about this stuff for ages. I have actually got some video. Oh, Dan, have you got some feedback you want to give from the groups? I don't know why you put your hand up.
Yeah, it's just quickly on the virtual group. We kind of went a little bit off track in terms of playing the game as we should have done.
It's fine.
But it was really interesting that we talked about the group. We talked about our own lived experiences and 1 or 2 things. But one thing that was particularly interesting that I wanted to just share with everyone is one of the guys in the group has a dwarfism condition and uses crutches. And we were talking about the ability to be able to see people like us on TV, on social media. And he mentioned about how Channel 4 had really changed the way that that people from sort of disability backgrounds, when they took the Paralympics back in 2012, have completely changed the way that people with disability challenges see themselves. And he just mentioned about how incredible that must have been for children, particularly, suddenly to be able to see that, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, that's it. And a lot of this, it all does start with the children. And this is the thing as well, that it's not just about being able to see themselves, but children being able to see other children that look different from them participating in the same way that they do.
Sorry, I just suddenly thought, obviously, number 2, it says you're not necessarily an expert and do you want to buy in some help? And I would have thought that would have been a good £100 of us well spent, because you know, I'm not an expert in discrimination, okay? And I just wondered, if I outsource my HR, I outsource my accounts, maybe I need to bring in some help to see what the business benefits and how I can maximise my £200.
This is true. I mean, this particularly was for you to purchase it for yourself, but yes, and I think, like I said, the recruitment, all of our processes are really, and there's so much research into the way that organisations have been set up with male, able-bodied, in some ways middle-class men to operate in, even back since the Industrial Revolution. I promise I will not go into it. I will not get on my hobby horse. But there's loads of research into how that's come about, and that actually men progressing through work always had a helpful wife at home. And it's in inverted commas because it doesn't have to necessarily be a wife, it could be a mother, but there was always a woman at home who was keeping the home fires burning. And a lot of this, all of our structures are built on this kind of image of this ideal worker. And to break those down does take standing back a little bit and saying, okay, what can I do differently about my recruitment, about my performance management, about all of my structures in my organisations to start breaking these barriers down. And I think it's something we've begun to realise in maybe the last 10 years, that a lot of the stuff we've been doing previously to break down discrimination, especially in kind of getting women into leadership, it's not working. And it's not working because there's some fundamental things there that we're missing. But yeah, that's great. If anybody does want more information on this stuff, just grab me, because I could talk about it for hours. So if you want any more information, just let me know. Okay, right, I'm going to move on. What I want to do now is just move this kind of from our kind of personal feelings about this back into the workplace. And I've got a little picture I want to paint you of my personal experiences. That's all I can really talk from. So this is a bit of a picture of kind of what it was like for me when I was working in the corporate world. So I was a senior consultant with a management consultancy, and it was fairly common for me to be the only woman in the room in most of our senior management meetings. I remember once looking around the room and there being more people named Dave than there were women in the room. And that was relatively common. Now, it was so common, it was something I was kind of used to, and I was okay with it. I had adapted, I had ways of dealing with it to make sure that I was still present in the meeting room. So that might mean that as I went into the meeting room, I would think about where I sat. I would sit at the head of the table if possible, so that I drew attention, so I was less likely to get talked over. If there was a person in particular who was likely to talk over me, I would sit opposite them so that I can make eye contact with them, because it makes it much more difficult to talk over somebody or interrupt them. Now, these aren't particularly difficult things to do, but it does mean that I'm putting in a different level of cognitive load. I'm thinking about what I'm doing, how I'm saying stuff, as well as what I'm saying. And the men in the room didn't necessarily have to do that. I also quite often felt like I was speaking for the whole of womanhood. If I get something wrong, we shouldn't have let women into senior roles, should we? Because look, she's messed it up. Instead of being the kind of white man in the room who, he's just Dave. He's just making a mistake as Dave, not as the whole of mankind. Now, I'm fairly outgoing. It wasn't generally an issue for me. I'm fairly confident, and I feel quite confident in putting myself forward in meetings. However, that can backfire as well, because there was times when I was accused of being too assertive, even when I was less forthright than the men in the meeting. And again, that's quite common from some of the research. Now, all of the people that I worked with were lovely people. They were friends. We worked together for a very long time. They were not the kind of people who would deliberately discriminate against somebody. They weren't doing it deliberately. They were doing it accidentally. And they were doing it because their categorizations of what a leader is had been influenced by decades of looking at leaders, decades of seeing that those leaders were men. And so their categorization was different. And it just made it a little bit difficult for them to interact with me as a senior leader. And again, there's loads of research about this going back into the 50s. But most alarmingly, having been redone in the 2000s, very recently, last 10 years, it's still the case that people will more naturally associate leadership characteristics with men than they will with women. And even more so, when they do associate leadership with a woman, they are then less likely to like her as a person. So there's still quite a bit of a balance to go at. We've still got a few things to fix, and that's just in one area of discrimination. Okay, so that's just my experience. But what I wanted to do, and I did say to you at the beginning, that I wanted you to start taking some actions. Now, I've got some actions up here. Oh, that's my story time slide. Right, okay, so on your desks, you've got a little QR code. This is me getting techie for the fact that I was coming to a tech talk, because I'm really not techie. So I was quite proud of myself with this. So what I would really like you to do is scan that code, and it takes you to a form where you can add your details and add the action. Now, this bit is voluntary, but the reason I'd like you to do this is so that I can follow up with you in 2 weeks, 3 weeks time to check on how you're doing on that action and to have some accountability on what you're doing. Now, so that you're not doing it alone, I want to talk about some of the things that I'm doing, things that I'm working on. So I think we've talked about language as I've moved around some of the groups. Language is a really important part of showing that we are being inclusive. Now, ableist language, it comes in a whole spread from really horrible words to some things that we might take naturally in our language. I have a habit of saying, oh, this is crazy, whenever something's really good or I'm really busy. That's something that I need to stop doing. That is ableist language that shows that I'm not thinking about the impact of my language on people. So that's one of the things that I'm working on. I'm also working on the word guys, and it's really difficult to get this out of my language because working with Americans for a long time, it's really hard. And I've tried to do it as I come around the room. I say folks, I say team, I say different words, but getting away from that default of guys is really tough, but it is something that I'm working on. Also, about my assumptions about people in romantic relationships. So I mentioned it to a couple of the tables at the back. We've got this kind of default conversation that we can have at work of when you get a new member of staff, oh, do you have a boyfriend? And it's that assumption that they will be in a heteronormative relationship, that they will have one partner, not more than one partner or no partners. We make certain assumptions that women have children. I don't have children, but the number of people that are shocked and surprised by the fact I don't have children and will ask fairly intrusive questions about it, it's amazing that that is still happening. So I'm trying to be more conscious of my assumptions around those romantic relationships. I once worked for a woman, and she had a really good way of doing this. When a new person came to the team, instead of saying, do you have a boyfriend, do you have a girlfriend, she would say, do you have any pets? So when they do the introduction, I want to know what your favourite biscuit is and do you have any pets? Now, what people do when they describe whether they've got pets is they describe their family home, and they do it by default, but they've not done it because somebody's made the assumption about what their home looks like. They've just been asked about their pets. And it was really nice, and it worked every single time she did it. Not sure if it was deliberate, but it worked really, really well. So again, that's something I'm trying. I'm also questioning the processes that I use in my business. So as my business grows, I'm starting to interact with more people and having more complex processes. How am I dealing with discrimination in my business? I need to make sure that I'm not implementing discriminative practices when I start going out there, but also helping other people question theirs. So those are my actions. Just take 5 minutes. I mean, it might be something that you can do over lunch, but do try and do it, because what I want to do is move this from a training room into the real world so that we're actually doing something with what we've talked about today, because that's the only way we make any real difference in this. Okay, I'll flick onto this so it's up there. You might be able to blip it from the screen, I don't know. Any questions?
Yeah, are we actually getting the PowerPoint presentations?
You can have it. Yeah, I don't actually know, but I have no problem.
We can send those out, that's fine.
Because it would be really interesting to have the references as well with that.
Right, yes. So on your action, there's a tick box to say go on my mailing list. If you want to do that, go on my mailing list, and I will send out the references and bore you all with all of the academic stuff. But if there's anything particular that you are interested in, just come and grab me and I'll be able, because I read dozens and dozens of papers every month. So if there's anything in particular that you're interested in, then let me know. One of the other things that I do on LinkedIn, every Thursday, I will pick a paper and I'll kind of convert it into kind of normal people language from academic language. So if you wanted to follow me on LinkedIn, that kind of comes up quite a lot. And I do send those out in my newsletter as well.
Moving on to the kind of the digital technology side of things.
Yes.
What's your take on the way that an awful lot of these biases are getting encoded into
Yes.
Algorithms, AI techniques, all these kind of things.
Yes, it's one of my pet hates. So one of the areas that comes up quite a lot, particularly in my work in recruitment, is psychometric testing. So I don't know if any of you have done the psychometric test if you've applied for jobs. The reason that this is coming in so much is people believe that it is non-discriminatory, and they are, and it is less discriminative. I'll give it that, it is less, but it's not perfect because those things have all been created by people and they just program them in. There's a bit of me that is concerned that actually by programming things in, we just lose the ability to understand how it is discriminatory because we can't track back quite as easily what happened. So I am nervous around it. I am nervous around the use of psychometrics in recruitment, but that's a personal stance.
There's a book called Invisible Women.
Oh, yeah.
And if you've got a moment to read it, I'd entirely recommend it. But it's equally frightening in terms of how much data is already biased, really, and is put into AI. And there's stuff on AI recruiting and matching people, and some of it's quite frightening, really, in terms of what's already in the system, and that need to be really wary that whatever our data is, that we need to be clear about making sure it's not just clean data, as you know, that whole side, but that we are not making it biased. So yeah, I think that's a whole conversation on it in itself, for sure.
Yeah.
Brilliant. If everybody has 5 minutes, then to have a go at that little thought on what your aspect is. Guys is definitely mine. I'm really good at that. Yeah. And then we'll move to lunch at past. It should be being put out as we speak, hopefully. So once you've done that, if you want to start making your way to the back and where the coffee and tea was, and that will be lunch. We're breaking lunch a little bit earlier, so we'll start the lightning talks about 1:15. And then that gives us a good time for us to network and chat to people and talk, and then we'll crack on again with the lightning talks, because they'll be quite fast and furious and lots of information to take in this afternoon, for sure. Okay, 5 minutes then to do this, and then we'll move into lunch.